Good morning. We are talking about dahlias today, and because this is a food forest, we're going to talk about the edible qualities of dahlias. Many people do not know that dahlias are edible, but the roots of dahlias actually are. The question I think that comes up most often is, how do they taste? And that is an interesting question. I think it's an interesting experience to try something that has really remained untested in terms of food quality over many generations. Although historically dahlias were probably used for food, and I believe they still are in some areas perhaps in South America, Central America, Mexico. I'm not entirely sure, but my understanding is that there are some dahlias that are eaten, but this isn't something we commonly grow. So I got my information and my first seeds from a William Whitson, who has a website called cultivariable.com. And if you are not familiar with cultivariable, if you're interested in growing tubers, you really need to check this guy out. He's a plant breeder. He has some really interesting ideas. He offers plants that nobody else has. Being a plant breeder, he can, because he breeds them himself. But also he goes into plants like, I'm probably going to pronounce this wrong, yacon and wild potatoes and things like that. Just very interesting things. So if you like trying interesting foods, check him out. I'm going to ask you to pardon all the background noise today. My neighbor is putting on a roof still, and so we've got a bit of background noise. Hopefully it's not being picked up too much in my microphone. So my first experience planting these was 2 summers ago, and I started them from seeds that I got from Cultivariable. They do offer tubers sometimes, but at the time that they were offering them, all of the tubers that they had were infected with a virus, and I decided I would start from the seeds since that would be a safer bet, just in terms of not starting something that I might regret later. So I got these seeds and I planted out several different seeds. I think I probably started with a dozen plants. I ended up with 4 that did really well, and I harvested them at the end of the season. Well, I was not experienced in saving the tubers from these plants, and I stupidly separated them in the fall. And that is really not good for dahlias. What happens is the dahlias tend to start sending up shoots very close to where they connect to the original root system, and so when you snap off the tuber, if you do that in the fall, quite often it's not going to grow back into anything in the spring. So you really need to wait until those little shoots start popping up if you want to separate your dahlia tubers. I made that mistake. I lost all of the tubers that I grew that year, which was a real disappointment, because some of them were very promising. However, I did save seeds from these same plants, and I labeled the seeds from which plant they came. And the 2 that ended up being the tastiest and the most attractive, well, one was the tastiest and one was the most attractive, and they had very different qualities. I saved each of those separately so I knew where they came, which one was which, and that was fortunate. So one of them was a very tall purple flower, and I just loved the flower. The tubers, as for flavor, they were a little on the piney side. They tasted a little bit like pine pitch. So I wasn't saving them for that, although they did have fairly large tubers. So my hope was that maybe the seeds, which I saved, would yield something that had the beautiful flower and something more delicious as a tuber. The other variety that I saved was what I just have to call a dwarf variety. It was only about that big at full full height. However, this variety had these little, like, spherical tubers. Now, many of the tubers that you'll find on dahlias are kind of stretched out. These were spherical, and they grew in a very tight clump right underneath the plant. So they didn't spread. And the dahlias don't spread as much as, say, a sweet potato, but they can spread, and that's hard when you're harvesting them to keep them all together. So if you're going to then save the tubers over the winter, if you drop the tubers off as you're digging them up, they may not be any good. Well, these tubers are all clumped together. So that plant, I decided I was going to focus on the dwarf plant, partly because I don't have a lot of space here. I have only about 1/10 of an acre where I am, and not all of it is garden. We like to have a little bit of space for picnics and that kind of thing in the summertime. So I only have the edges to work with and the front yard. So having a smaller plant is very useful to me. So I focused this past year on the seeds from that dwarf plant, and I grew out several of those. We had a very dry summer, and not all of these plants made it. But the two that I saved, one was a actually the leaves were very dark, almost purplish in color, the leaves of the plant. And the flower was attractive too, but the leaves were really what stuck out as just being really striking. So there was that one, and then there was another one that was, it grew also in a dwarf variety. I think a couple of them may have started to grow taller, and I just disposed of those before I planted them. The other ones that I grew, they didn't really form sizable tubers, and none of these plants really ended up yielding lots of seeds. So I didn't end up collecting a lot of the seeds. I still have some from the previous year anyway. And I didn't really have a preference between the plants, except for that very dark colored one that I wanted to save. And I tried to collect seeds off of that one, and it just didn't yield very many seeds. So I don't have seeds from that one, but I do have the tubers, and I'm taking very, very good care of them this winter. So I hope that those will last through the winter and be viable in the spring. We shall see. Otherwise, I'm back to square one with my seeds. So the flavor, getting more into that, the dark variety that I liked also coincidentally had very good tasting tubers, which is why I'm really hoping these last and make it through the winter, and I hope I can propagate them next year. These tubers had none of the piney flavor that I experienced the year before. They were sweet, they were crunchy, a bit like a good Jerusalem artichoke, except the flowers are so much more attractive on these dahlias than they are on the Jerusalem artichokes, that I feel like if we can perfect varieties of dahlias to grow, we may find them preferable to the Jerusalem artichokes in many ways. And the two are pretty closely related. The other thing about dahlias is they're not invasive, or invasive is the wrong word. I want to say opportunistic, like Jerusalem artichokes are. They are native plants, so I wouldn't call them invasive, but they can really take over a garden, whereas dahlias will not do that. And in my region, they will not overwinter in the soil, so you have to bring them in. In fact, that's true unless you live pretty far south in the United States. You'll have to bring in your dahlia tubers in the wintertime, put them back out in the spring. So they're perennials, but they are not carefree perennials in my region, which is zone 6B. So in New England, you can grow dahlias, you just have to bring them in the wintertime. And I don't know how far south you have to get before they start being able to last through the entire winter in the soil. But I would assume that if the soil doesn't freeze, you're probably okay. But look that up. So don't quote me on any of that. If you are interested in doing this kind of experiment yourself, I would go and take a look and browse the seeds available on cultivariable.com, and there aren't too many left for this season. So you'll want to take a look and see what they have to offer, and maybe get yourself some seeds to try. And I think what you'll find is you'll find some of the tubers are a little bit, sometimes they can be a little stringy or just hard to chew. But the best of them are crisp and a lot of water in them, and also a sweet flavor without the pininess, which I discovered in some of mine. Apparently some varieties also have a radish sort of flavor to them, which you may or may not enjoy. So I would advise you to check this out. Now this falls into the realm of what I call stealth edibles. So plants that you could put in your front yard, you could be growing food, and also just have a beautiful garden that people would walk by and say, wow, that's really beautiful. But you can also eat the food from it. So dahlias fall into that category. I also include things like hostas, like honeyberries, which is a berry that grows on a certain types of honeysuckle, very cold hardy. So those are a good option. Daylilies, another example of an edible flower that can be grown as an ornamental, and you can really impress people with your beautiful flowers, and also have something to harvest as well. So that is all about edible dahlias. I would encourage you, if you're going to try this, to start slowly with tasting to make sure they agree with you. I know that Jerusalem artichokes cause flatulence. I'm not sure if the same is true about dahlias. I've never been able to eat enough of them to tell. So just something to consider. And but it's definitely worth experimenting with because of this multiple use plant. It's got beautiful flowers, but also edible tubers. So I hope you leave me a thumbs up. Hope you leave some comments below, especially if you've experimented with this plant in the past. And I hope you take a look at the foodforestgardenclub.org. We're having a great time there. So it's a garden club for you. It is a great way for us all to get together and actually, sometimes talk in person, online, and that sort of thing. Also, please subscribe to this channel. I'm looking for a few more subscribers this week. I really appreciate your support. So thank you so much. I hope you have a great day.